Thanks for joining us. This is the first time Christine and I have done this, so we're hoping to do more. We're hoping to do more like this to more people, and also if there's any subjects or topics around virtual reality, the use of virtual reality in learning development and DEI training, or around AI, and I'll explain why that is, please suggest topics you'd like to hear from us on. Also, please feel free, at the end there's sort of like a Q&A session and you can ask anything around this subject. And also we'd really value feedback, because obviously part of the process Christine and I go through to create what we do is all around talking with people who have lived experience, and continually changing and improving what we do. So if there's things we miss out, there's things you'd like to know more about, or you think the structure of the presentation, there's areas we could do more or less, please tell us at the end. So this is actually basically an essentials workshop on how virtual reality and learning and development sort of coexist, and I'll talk a bit about the actual VR side of things, and then Christine will be talking more about how actually to integrate virtual reality into the learnings.
Okay, before we get started, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet. We're shaping a future where leadership, empathy, and diversity can thrive. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land and acknowledge elders past, present, and future. I'm coming to you from Turrbal and Yagara land, and Simon is on Narrow land.
Yeah. So for those having all the temperature discussions, by the way, I live in North Queensland, and it's still like 26 degrees. So just so you know.
Yeah.
Please don't leave
Simon
the meeting.
Is the person we hate the most on weather. So as Simon alluded to earlier, my name is obviously Christine. I've introduced myself. So I run an organization called Utano Global. We're a one-stop diversity, equity, and inclusion management consulting practice. We provide training and executive coaching and leadership using immersive learning experience, and that's what we're here to talk to you about, virtual reality and gamification. We provide you with consulting services around DEI strategies. We're really interested in your implementation, because a lot of organizations already have strategies or thinking about strategies, but how do you actually implement them, and how do you implement them in an effective way? And we found virtual reality to be the most effective. And throughout this presentation, we'll be talking to you about why. We also do inclusive recruitment and cultural capability training and DEI research.
And I'm Simon. So my team of computer programmers and game designers all love drawing pictures, and this is just one of the avatars of me. I've got about 7 now, so I'm more than happy to share with them. So us as an organisation, we're on a mission we really want to deepen people's understanding of each other and themselves, and we found that virtual reality is the best way of doing that. We will share this presentation with you afterwards, so you can click on all the links. So we kind of our mission is basically to create a more connected and inclusive world. And in essence, what we do and what virtual reality can do is create safe spaces for people to feel what it's like to be someone else, practice tough situations, and practice difficult conversations, so they have the tool sets in real life to actually sort of do something if it needs to be done. So overview of this session quickly. I'm going to talk a bit about what is virtual reality. Obviously, some of you who has used virtual reality before, just quickly sort of speak out. Anyone?
Yeah, we'll use your reactions. Yeah.
Okay. So why virtual reality is good for learning and development? How do you integrate it with your learning and development? We've done some work with big organisations before, and lots of trainers feel that the virtual reality is like a threat and is going to take away their job. It's actually far from it. It basically enables trainers to actually upskill themselves and actually make their training more impactful. We'll talk about that later. One of the benefits, Q&A session, and then post-session actions. So what is VR? So there's loads of headsets going around at the moment. When we first started doing virtual reality about 5 years ago, you needed a $5,000 laptop and a $2,000 virtual reality kit that had cables everywhere just to do it. You can now pick up a Meta Quest 2 for around $300. And they don't need to be tethered to a computer. Everything is in the headset. And contrary to popular belief, they're not like the VR you used to have on your mobile phone. Only sort of like 5-10% of people would get motion sickness from these VR headsets these days because they actually move with your body. So you have MetaQuest 2, 3, and the Pro, Pico Neo, which is actually owned by TikTok, HTC Vive, which is a Taiwanese company. Apple are coming out with new headsets. I'm sure a lot of you have seen all that. They're costing about $5,000 to $7,000 each. And then there's rumors that Google coming out with headsets. So there is a proliferation of headsets that are getting cheaper and cheaper that makes it much more accessible. So in the training world, there's two kinds of virtual reality training. One is kind of like hard skills training, which is like how do you use a fire extinguisher to put a car out? And then there's the human-centered or soft skills, I hate that phrase, which is how do you recreate and simulate human-to-human interaction. So it's worth noting that when you have the hard skills training, like how do you drive something, how do you gamify a process? Once you've figured out the process, you do an exercise, you can tick a box, and then you can go home and you've learned how to do something. The reason, obviously, People Tech Revolution works with people like Christine is, excuse me, the virtual reality we do can be quite triggering. It can be quite emotive. It deals with complex situations like sexism, racism, sort of disability exclusion, neurodiversity, and it can and should, which is the whole point, raise difficult discussions within an organization and team. And that requires a workshop to be wrapped around about how do you facilitate those discussions to actually achieve the outcomes you want. So we specialize in the sort of like the human-centered area, particularly in the healthcare system. And Hayden might have used some of the stuff we built for Marta, actually. So what is human-centered virtual reality and what do we do? So I just kind of mentioned that it is anywhere where humans interact with another human, we can simulate that. So whether it be in a workplace, whether it be a difficult conversation, how to give bad news, how to de-escalate a situation, think anything where humans can interact, we can simulate that in virtual realities to equip people to deal with it. The image on the left here is we can also look at things like interview practice, or this was something we built for a program called Young Enterprising Women. That was around how can you induce stress, and so people can practice pitching. So what we can do, we can induce stress by putting heartbeats and vignettes and all the clever things like that. And then someone can deliver a pitch and they can watch themselves back. So there are lots of mechanics around this virtual reality that can be used around clicking bias, tracking the eyes, self-reflection, all around how you behave with others. And it's all on the purpose to create that behavior change we're looking for, or increase your confidence to say something. So typically a virtual reality experience around diversity, equity, inclusion, or around changing behavior can take the form of different things. So it can be an experience where you feel, so I felt what it feels like to be an older person lying in bed who is just being ignored within the healthcare system. So that's normally the first thing we try and do is invoke an emotion and a feeling, which means that the learnings and the things you're trying to teach stick because they can create empathy. Then you have the advocacy side of things. Like, I saw something happen, or I thought you said that incorrectly. And how do you experience that? And then how do you interject? You can then look at the inquiry. I wonder if I did this, or I wonder if, and we can create gaming and branching narratives around that to sort of teach the right pathways and different outcomes based upon people's experience. Then you can observe, which is I learned how to do something. And then you can action, which is starts getting into the really important point. It's like, I can interject, or I can say something. And so we do that in virtual reality in a number of ways where you can learn a methodology, but then you can speak in your own voice and you can record that voice and you can practice what to say. Then you can, I heard, which is that I can hear my own voice, I can hear what other people are saying around me. And then the practice part is I empower. So you can practice over and over again. So until you've figured out what to say and how to say it and have the confidence to say it. So they're the kind of experiences we can replicate in virtual reality.
So all of you have logged from your different organizations, and you're here to learn about how virtual reality can assist you with meeting your learning and development goals. And usually when we talk to organizations, the first thing we try to understand is what is the problem that you're trying to solve. Obviously, you want to increase productivity and enhance professional development opportunities for your workers. You want to improve engagement in learning and increase the retention of information that's learned. You also want to do it in a way that increases psychological safety. Now, particularly when you're talking about topics where they can be a little bit confrontational, or topics that people are avoiding having conversations around, difficult conversations. This can actually be really quite challenging as to how do you bring this about within an organization. So that's why we found that working with immersive learning, predominantly VR, is really a tool in enhancing that psychological safety and getting managers and leaders to stop avoiding a lot of the conversations that they should be having, or find a way to use either through this simulated experience, a third-party existential experience, in order for you to actually find a way to have these conversations with your staff, but to do it in a way that is inclusive and to do it in a way that everybody feels safe and supported. There's nobody who wants to have a conversation that's difficult enough that, you know, they feel they're in a threat environment. So really that psychological safety is a core factor in how we design the trainings that we do. Next slide, Simon.
Cool.
So some of the benefits of VR in learning and development. So Simon's alluded to a lot of these earlier, but traditional learning methods that you're using within your organization probably involve, you know, PowerPoint presentations. They probably involve somebody coming to your premises and delivering some sort of face-to-face training. And there's obviously limitations around that. There's also the e-learning, which is really, really popular, which again, there's limitations around that. So if we talk about the face-to-face, for example, there's limitation around scalability and consistency, because a lot of that depends on basically the facilitator that's in front of you. It also sometimes lacks the emotional connection, like when you look at things like e-learning, for example, and meaningful engagement, because particularly if you're using videos, just videos, for example, somebody can play an e-learning video and it plays to the end and you walk away, you make a cup of tea, you come back, you click finish, but you haven't really engaged in the learning in a meaningful way. And although e-learning has come quite a long way in developing some of those interactive elements, it's still got some way to go. And this is where we found virtual reality is just that next step up. VR can be used to enhance a lot of your learning outcomes, including, and it's also a very exciting and novel technology. And this we found has been one of the reasons why it's most memorable, because how many people are going to a training where, you know, you're putting on a headset, just the experience, you're getting into, to walk a mile inside somebody else's shoes, and just the impact that VR has on your brain and really taking you into the center of the experience really is massive game changers. So the examples of the industries that we're working in at the moment, we're working in all sorts of industries. So health. Sorry.
That's right.
Yeah,
I was just about to say. So yeah, examples of the stuff we're working in. So we've done a lot of work in health. So we have done some work with Marta. We've done work with Mayo Clinic, and in the health area, it's like anywhere where there's a hierarchical system. So health, military, police, a large organisation, for example. Is how can you have respectful conversations? How can you have difficult discussions around things you've either noticed, around bias, around how you think someone might be treated unfairly? So as a manager, how do you have those difficult conversations? As a bystander, how can you practice have those difficult conversations? And that's basically like nurses calling out doctors or junior doctors talking to senior doctors. So we've done a lot of work in that health area and with large sort of hierarchical structured organizations. Disability inclusion is another really good use case. So one of the really good things about virtual reality, as well as looking in the mirror and becoming someone else and going through an experience that is, this is what it feels like to experience prejudice or bias, you can also experience what it feels like to be in a different position. So it's very powerful when a man who might be, 5'11", 6 foot, goes into a situation and suddenly becomes 5'3", 5'4", and everyone's looking down on you. And even more powerful is if you navigate the world in a wheelchair or as a smaller person. So the actual just creating the difference of perspective, and we've done that with disability inclusion around how hard it is to navigate the world in a wheelchair, and to create awareness around the reason we made this was they wanted people to design events and design services and products to be more inclusive, to be more accessible, and they wanted to use empathy and as a learning tool to do that. And it was also looking at how overbearing or how overwhelming certain situations can be if you have neurodiversity or dementia. And we can build all that into VR to improve design outcomes. And the other use case is things around de-escalation. So we've been working with an airline around how cabin crew can de-escalate a situation. What are the right protocols? So as well as the sequence of events you can gamify to make sure they get it right, it's like, what do you say and how do you deal with this situation? How can you create a safe space that induces stress that isn't role play? Because everyone who did role play didn't take it seriously. So if it happens in real life, you're equipped to deal with it. So there's kind of like 3 use cases we've been working on. They've been really, really good use cases for VR.
And everybody loves good statistics. So what does research actually say about virtual reality and how are organizations using it, particularly to incorporate into the training for employees? So basically, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a study in 2002, so it's quite a recent study, where they looked at emerging technologies and they specifically looked at VR and how it compares to traditional learnings, which I talked about earlier. So if you look on the right-hand side, you've got improvements, you've got a bar graph which shows the correlation between improved learning outcomes in VR versus the classroom and e-learning environment. And you can see that virtual reality is streets ahead of everybody, of every other learning method. And if you look at what you get on the left-hand side, 29 minutes of VR is the equivalent of 2 hours of classroom time. And so from an efficiency perspective, you will notice that virtual reality is 4 times faster at simulating a training experience than anything else that's out there that's been used for soft skills training. Employees are more emotionally connected to VR content. So early on, Simon was talking about the different sectors that we work in and the different experiences that people have. Connecting your hand, heart, and mind into an experience and a learning requires actually ensures that there's action that follows on from that. How many of you have gone to a training experience, and you've sat through it because either it's mandatory or you're kind of ticking the box, and if people are honest, at some point we've all been to those types of trainings, and you walk out of there and you don't really do anything because it hasn't really connected with your heart, it hasn't moved your emotions. And particularly with diversity, equity, and inclusion training, because it's really contextual, it's really about understanding another person's experience of exclusion in particular sets of circumstance. And these soft skills trainings are really hard to do in terms if you do not have that emotional connection. And you can see the comparison with virtual reality and the classroom and the e-learning environment. Again, virtual reality is 20 times faster with that emotional connection than the classroom and the e-learning environment. And virtual reality learners are more focused because you've got the headsets on, right? You're surrounded, you're in that space, your brain has been taken there. You can't wander off, look at your phone, look at what's, going on outside the window. Whereas you can do that with e-learning, you can do that with the classroom environment.
So I know, this is one of my favorite stats. If you talk to people with budgets or you're interested in how do we get funding for virtual reality, or how do I get it past head of HR? So we just summarize these stats for you. So it's 4 times faster to train in the classroom. It really does increase confidence to apply the learned skills. And to me, that's the number one thing. It's like it gives people a tool to say something. I actually have anecdotally spoken to a nurse recently, gone through some training, and they said it was the best training they'd ever done because it gave them words to actually say in real life in an event that actually happened. Much more emotionally connected to content, and they're more focused. So we'll send this presentation to everybody so you can have the links to all of these things. So how do you integrate virtual reality, this great tool that we've been talking about, into your learning and development goals? Well, as with anything else, Simon has spoken to you about the costs. So one of the things you need to obviously understand is what
are your learning and development costs right now? How do you currently deliver your training? So really understand your status quo and where it is that you're trying to get to. And so how can you use virtual reality and this technology to achieve your goals and setting realistic goals? So when we go into organizations, so when we go through a co-design process, we really sit with you and talk through what your objectives are and what you're trying to achieve, because there are many ways that we can integrate VR into your learning. So we want to know, what are the key behaviors that you'd like to explore in a VR scenario. We'll talk to you a little bit later about what is available in terms of content-wise, but we really need to understand what is the problem you're trying to solve, or what are the challenges that your organization is trying to face, that we make sure that we tailor the virtual reality scenario to the actual learning outcomes that we have defined. And that's really critical. What would someone learn by going through that experience?
Oh, sorry.
Oops, that's all right.
There you go.
What would someone learn by going through that experience and the problem you're trying to solve? Next slide. So I've just put together a typical 2-hour workshop that we run through for executives and leaders using virtual reality. So we have, at the start, like with anything, we do an opening and a welcome. We invite somebody from the organization to really set the strategic direction, because you know, a lot of the times, particularly with diversity, equity, and inclusion training, sometimes there can be a bit of pushback, and people can see it as a bit of tick the box exercise, and oh my gosh, you're bringing gimmicks as well. So it's kind of really important that that strategic direction is set, and why VR is being used in this context, and it's set by a senior person within that organization, so that people within that organization know that there is buy-in from the very top. When we open up, we do an opening poll, because statistics are really important, and usually people really rate themselves quite high in terms of their understanding of the subject matter and the topic, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their understanding of, where they think their organization is at. So we keep those results of that opening poll. We get into an icebreaker. So for those of you who've never really experienced virtual reality, we want you to understand the impact that VR has on your senses and how you really get immersed in that. And we start with an icebreaker session that's quite visceral and exciting, and gets your blood flowing, and really gets you in that moment. You experience all of those range of emotions, flight or fright, fear responses, and all of that. So it really gets you sensitized to the VR experience. After we've done that, we do a quick debrief with you to get a bit of feedback. Then we use, based on what we've co-designed with you, we then launch into the first of our diversity, equity, and inclusion apps using the PTR library. And usually we pick, depending on what topic around diversity, equity, and inclusion you've chosen, it could be around gender, race, culture, disability inclusion, sexual orientation, the list goes on. It just depends what areas you're wanting to focus in. So that experience will be based around those topics that we have identified. And again, we immerse learners in that experience. You then take you out of that experience. So usually that first experience is about 5 to 7 minutes. In VR. And then when people come out of that experience, we gather together in a storytelling circle. Now, the reason we use storytelling as a key anchor is diversity, equity, and inclusion is really about hearing a person's story and a person's experience. So we use the yarning circle. We take that from Aboriginal culture, and we also use the TEST framework, which stands for Transformational Ethical Storytelling. And so these two frameworks allow us to really center the storytelling with the story holder. How many of you have told your story about an experience, and then when you see it retold, it hardly resembles what it is you were trying to convey? So we really try to honor the story holder throughout this whole process, because it's really about your personal experience. So we do that anchoring around that first experience, and we make sure that everybody is seen and everybody is heard and everybody has that opportunity to contribute. We then take you into a second a VR experience, which is a little bit shorter, and it usually mirrors, micro scenarios, and it might focus on one or two situations that are within the workplace that focus on things like microaggressions or things that people have noticed that they experience in the workplace. And these are very short micro scenarios, and we have people experience these. These are about 3 to 5 minutes in terms of those scenarios. So we've got an app in the PTR library called Mindshift VR, and Simon will talk a little bit more about that later on. So once we finish that experience, we take you out of that and we do the second storytelling activity. And so again, we debrief, and then after we finish the debriefing, we then do a closing poll. And what we found is when we mirror the opening poll and closing poll, because we ask the exact same question, there is always, in every single workshop that I've done, there is a sliding down of where people were, at the beginning we thought we understood, we, could really empathize. But now that I've been through that experience, I realized that, I didn't actually know what I thought I knew in the beginning. So that's usually what happens when we compare the opening and the closing poll, because it's the exact same questions. Then we talk to you about, next steps, depending on what your organization has agreed they would want to take this learning process forward. And next slide.
So I'll just quickly talk about some of the virtual reality experiences in the PTR library, just so you can get an understanding of some of the things you can actually use in virtual reality. So we have one called Mindshift VR, and it is basically, they're quite short interactive VR experiences. You can, by interactive, I mean you can talk in your own voice. They're all related to sort of diversity, gender, equity and inclusion, and they're depending on, we have 5 now, and depending what the topic is, like as Christine alluded to, it depends on which ones you can choose, but they're all talking your own voice. So they get people to practice how to deal with a difficult situation. We have the longer scenarios that kind of like in the reality suite, and they're normally like sort of 2 or 3 apps long, and you'll embody what it feels like to be somebody, and then you'll be in a meeting room and learn how to act in different situations, or how to recognize bias, and how to or what it feels like to be discriminated against, and what to do in different situations. And they're longer, they're sort of like 7 to 10 minute range. Then we had Lift VR, and we built this specifically because we had a client say, oh, these incidental conversations that happen in the workplace, like these water cooler conversations, or around difficult conversations, so especially around leadership and management, and like if someone opens up and says something around recruitment or a gender policy they feel is unfair, how can you react and think on the spot? Like teaching people how to calmly react to a situation that could be confronting in a confined space that involves stress. So that was kind of Lift VR. We are just about to add a 10th app that I'll talk about in a minute. So where the future of VR is going, in our opinion, obviously, the headsets are getting more and more technically better. The graphics card is getting better. Everything's improving. And obviously, AI is the big hit word of the year. And we actually can now integrate AI into virtual reality. So one of the things we're exploring is you can go through these scenarios, but how do you build in AI in terms of the conversation, and also in different areas of the experience. So we now can have AI, a facilitator in AI that says you can ask questions to about what scenario should I go through? What does this scenario do? How should I experience the scenario? What do I need? And so they can give you feedback based upon all our scripts. We've also got a reflection scene in VR where people can ask how you felt, and it's a quick moment of debriefing and recognizing what you went through, and before you go back into the facilitated discussion. Or if you're doing it by yourself and you need an actual facilitator to actually go through some of your emotions. And we're looking at how AI can actually be used to practice difficult situations. So we're now looking at training AI around how we can have these interactions in real time. That hasn't happened yet because there's quite a lot of training around and bias, and we have to be very careful with how we do that, because I'm sure if you experience AI that goes down a rabbit hole and turns out to be awful. So we are experimenting with that area of VR. So that's the floor's open for user questions now, because I think we've got 10 minutes left. Does anybody like to ask anything about what we've just talked about?
I'm interested in that concept of nausea and using the headset. I hear so many people tell me about how it's going to make them sick, etc. So I'm really interested in that background. If you have any more information on that.
So when VR first started, a lot of it was mobile phone VR, where you could put your phone into a headset, put it on, and it basically just split the screen, basically split your brain in half, and didn't track with your movement. So it was like being under a cabin on a boat in the ocean. So you could look somewhere, and the movement wasn't corresponding to what your body was doing. So it made lots of people sick, basically seasick. Mobile VR isn't a thing anymore, thank God. The new VR headsets are so accurate with your body movement in terms of they will look where you look. You can even move your eyes within some of the VR headsets without moving your head, and you'll be able to see what you can see because they can track your eyes. It can also track your whole body a lot of the time. The depth of field is also much improved in terms of it's not just a split screen, it actually has sort of like perspective. So most people don't get nausea in VR. Some people still do. There are a percentage of people who still do, and if they do, you can. One of the big things about using virtual reality is how you onboard and offboard people. So if someone feels uncomfortable at any time during virtual reality, and we have a whole list of how you do this, they were allowed to take it off at any one time. They can step out of the boundary, or you can take it off if they ask you. We also advise that you should not spend more than like 20 minutes in VR. 20 minutes to half an hour. I've spent hours in it, but that can also be sort of disorientating as well, to be in that world for that long. So I hope that answers your question. It's a lot rarer than it used to be, but it still happens. Some people still find it can induce nausea, but the legacy of the mobile phones, where it probably induced nausea in like 80% of people, is something that's kind of like carried on a bit. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I appreciate that answer.
Cool. Sienna, Jasmine, Nick?
Yeah, I had a quick question about some of the other ways you can use VR. So I know we've spoken a lot about the diversity, equity, inclusion framework, but sort of space here, but maybe broader aspects of learning and development, career coaching, performance development, hard conversations around in the employment cycle. So just wondering about usability across other functions.
So
I think, so while we focus specifically on diversity, equity, inclusion, it's broadly speaking around soft skills training, around human interaction training. If you remember right at the beginning, Simon talked a lot about that. So it's applicable in all of those scenarios that you have talked about. So basically, that's why we go through a co-design process with you from a learning and development perspective. It's really about understanding what are your learning and development objectives, where are you as an organization wanting to go, where are you finding some challenges, and really can then work with you around how we can simulate that. And I think Simon can talk to you a little bit about the custom build side of things as well, because while we've talked to you about apps that are already there, we can also go through a co-design process where we build things that are very specific to organizational needs. So I'll let Simon talk about that.
So basically, yes, we can. Well, we are looking at different areas of VR, not just diversity, equity, inclusion training. So we are looking at like job interview simulations. We are looking at how do you, as a leader or manager, have difficult reviews, or how can you practice difficult reviews with your colleagues. We're looking at de-escalation techniques for police force or for emergency services, or we were looking at things like if you're a bar staff training. So obviously, I've been talking to an organisation that does the certificate so your responsible services of alcohol, and they have to do role play with regards, how do you recognise a drunk person, or how do you deal with someone who's aggressive and drunk. They said it's awful. Everyone always passes because no one can take it seriously. But they're looking at VR in terms of like, how can you actually use virtual reality to distinguish who's drunk, who's not? How do you de-escalate the situation if someone's sort of being aggressive or coming towards you too quickly? So all these things are something you can do in VR. So this is really powerful. And we're doing an emergency room simulation in America at the moment, and we've linked up the VR headsets to heart rate monitor to measure the stress response of people to different situations. So yes, to answer your question, we are looking at all these other areas. We're just looking for people who would like to do it. Nick, you put your camera back on. Does that mean you got a question coming?
Yes, indeed. I take it VR is more for individual, one-on-one. Just wondering if there's use cases for where it's sort of connecting or it's integrated with like group interaction, because it's replacing what humans do face to face. Is there situations where there can be a group, maybe have a remote team with some guy somewhere? Is there a way that infuses into that? Or yeah.
Do you want me to answer this, Christine? Do you want to have a go? Or do you want me to answer this, Christine?
I'll go first because I think I sort of understand what he's asking, and then Simon, if you can come in.
Okay.
So Nick, from a group training situation, so the workshops that we run are group workshops, and so there's while the individual headsets, because obviously they can only be on one person at a time, for us to do the storytelling and the anchoring of the experiences, you obviously need a group dynamic to be able to share that and get multiple perspectives. So that's where we use the yarning circle and the test framework to anchor that in a group setting. So that's how we use the group dynamics. But we also want to make sure that those groups don't get too large. So we found that, the sweet spot is about 10 to maximum about 15, like that absolute maximum, because other than that, it gets too big. It gets a bit unwieldy. And so, so that's the maximum number that we found that works really, really well in that space. Simon, did you want to add anything?
Yes, another interesting thing we can do, and we did it for Mayo Clinic in America, is creating a group in VR. So imagine the six of us, six, all wanted to be in a training session run by Christine. We can we can build a metaverse classroom. So we could all be on Zoom like this and go like, hi everyone, we're going to go through training now. And then we could all put on a VR headset anywhere in the world that has internet and meet in VR. And that in itself is quite an interesting exercise in bias design, because we're like, what does your avatar look like in VR? Do you choose? So you could design how you look in terms of I look like I look, or will some people design something completely different to how they look, and will people be treated differently? So we basically assign people an avatar that is kind of humanoid looking and is a stupid color like pink, purple, green, anything just to avoid bias within that system, with that area. And then someone can be wearing a facilitator sash, and so they're the facilitator. So you can all have a chat in VR. You can write on whiteboards. You can watch videos. You can then go in, and then you can then go into the individual experiences that you experience the same. Any of the experiences there in our library, you'll go through that individually, and then you can collectively come back into the space and have a discussion. In terms of interacting within a VR scenario, in terms of like, we haven't done that yet. In terms of there's two of you in a scenario interacting with avatars. We haven't done that yet because I'm not sure the computing power exists within the headsets to do it. I'll have to ask my CTO. Does that answer your question okay?
Oh yeah. It's shed some light. There's possibilities.
Cool.
And there was also in that question, there was also an element of the actual also like face to face, so that you are mixing and meshing the.
Yeah. So when Mayo did it in the metaverse, they had everyone on a Zoom call. Hi. Right now we're going to go in VR. They all had their setup space in VR, and it's all instructions. They all met in VR. They were there for like 30, 40 minutes. We said 30 minutes was maximum. That's kind of what they did. Then they all came out, met on Zoom again. So it was a combined experience. But it meant that when they had to focus, they were all in VR focusing. They weren't like, off making a cup of coffee or something.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
If we've got time for just one more, I had a question. I noticed your session plan includes quite a bit of time getting people adjusted to VR and using the tools and being comfortable in that space.
Mhm.
Can I ask what kind of resistance or pushback or concerns have you maybe faced in other organisations, and how have you dealt with those?
So concerns with respect to the actual VR or the topic?
Yeah, no, the actual VR, because I imagine there'd be some resistance to, I guess maybe feeling a little bit silly with the headset on around other people and like
Yeah.
not being comfortable with the technology, like all of that kind of stuff. So curious about how
Yeah,
that's
so
managed.
all that happens. But a lot of the icebreaker that we do in the beginning, that's really a fun activity. So we try as much as possible to integrate that into people getting comfortable with virtual reality and using it. There's some people who flat out said no, they don't want to have the experience, because I remember earlier we were talking about nausea. Some people have vertigo and other people have maybe used VR before and had a bad experience. I once did a workshop in Melbourne where 2 of the senior executives chose to watch one of the experiences on a flat screen. I mean, it's not the same as being immersed in that, and they chose to watch it on a flat screen because they had a horrible experience with virtual reality and they weren't willing to go there again. There was one lady who basically went in for like 2 minutes and took it off, and she said not feeling it, and she just took it off. So basically, the tech assistants and people are there to assist people to have a fantastic experience, and 90% of the time it's positive experience. There is the odd 10% where we do have to manage that. We have had a scenario where people have bumped into each other accidentally and things like that because they've been so absorbed in the experience. So we've had those things happen too. Simon, you might want to add some of your experience.
I can add a bit to that. So the first experience you want people to have in VR, I've never used it, basically sparks joy. It's joy, emotion, fun. And that's how we get the buy-in to do serious stuff later. In terms of the greater buy-in to VR, I think I alluded to it earlier around people saying it's a gimmick. Why can't we just do normal role play? And are you replacing trainers? I think that's the pushback we've had, especially in large organizations who think that the management's trying to basically replace them with VR. And what we try and kind of like advise is that imagine like YouTube videos, imagine role playing, imagine anywhere where you're trying to get people to feel emotions or interact. We can actually do all that way, way, way better in virtual reality. So trainers just need to be retrained in how to integrate virtual reality into what they already do, and become themselves sort of like au fait and knowledgeable about how it works that we can help with. And so it's a journey. And so normally we just start with small pilot projects and it grows from there. But I think getting buy-in from the leadership at the top of the food chain is obviously important as well. And that's kind of like goes down to return on investment, effectiveness of training. It can help with recruitment. It can help with retention of staff, that I know is an expensive thing. So I'm more than happy to have another chat about that if you'd like. But does that help at all?
It does. It sounds like you have, thought about how do we make this a safe space, and giving people the option to opt out of, doing the activity with the goggles on is totally something that's, normal and encouraged, and they're told that they can do that when they start, kind of thing.
Yeah, everything about what we do is about creating a safe space to sort of like have these difficult discussions. And I think what we have found is if you say virtual reality is going to be part of the training, unless the training's mandatory and you have to do it, some people don't do it. But if you say, oh, by the way, part of this is training, you're going to do virtual reality, the sign-ups to do training is much higher, just because of the inquisitive nature of people going like, really? I'll do that then.
I imagine it's probably like split down the middle. There'd be people who are going, oh, yes, VR, I'm so keen. And then people who, are a bit more hesitant and go, I'm going to feel sick, or I'm going to look silly, or that's a bit scary. Like, yeah.
So, with the I'm going to feel sick, certainly in my experience, it's been very much in the minority in terms of that. There's people who come more with the trepidation of not knowing. A lot of people, their kids have VR headsets because a lot of the, I guess, the demographic groups that we work with a lot, particularly when you're talking about leaders and managers, they have young, they're a certain age demographic.
Yes,
and so you find there is trepidation when people come in. It's more fear of the unknown, really. And sometimes the stories they've had in their head about the experience that they will have. We've actually had, I had one leader who was, quite nervous. And obviously we talked them through, and a young person I had a really young team that was supporting me at that time. And so a bunch of 19-year-olds and, they talked him through the experience, the senior executive. And that was really an interesting dynamic from a DEI perspective, because you've got these younger generation who've grown up with technology all around them, no fear. And you've got the senior executive coming in saying, okay, I'm doing this. And that dynamic of, almost that reverse mentorship really was, helping to put him at ease. No, this is how this works. And, just if I'm going to step away now, but I'm right here. If you're not happy with anything, just talking them through that really calms people down. So we found it's not so much the fear of I'm going to get sick. It's more the worry around that unknown if they've not had that experience.
Yeah, that reversal of I guess authority or power is so interesting in this space. I think that I hadn't even considered that. Like, yeah, that actually sounds really impactful. No, thank you.
Yeah, that was quite impactful. Yeah, and I'm conscious of time, Simon.
Me too. So I think that kind of like I know we've run past 5 minutes. Thank you for staying on. So that's something we'll take into account. So I think I've got some feedback from the questions you've asked that we can include in a future sort of workshop. Is there anything else that you'd like to see us talk about in these workshops, or how do you think that was? It'd be good to get any of your feedback, please.
I thought it was really great, really informative. I really like sort of the data on, the learning translation in terms of, comparing it to everyday learning that we're used to. And the different generational kind of components too. I'm finding really interesting. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you. So after this, if you want to get in touch with me or Christine, our details are on the presentation that we'll send to you. There'll also be a sort of like some offers. We'll send you some offers around. I think we were talking about it, Jasmine. Like, if you want to have a headset with our VR library on it, there'll be a link to say buy a VR headset. We can actually buy the headset, put all our library on it, and we'll post it to you. And if you want to engage Christine as a consultant around how you design these workshops using VR, or if you want Christine to facilitate workshops, that's something else that also the details will be there. So from me, thank you very much for attending our first ever Zoom How to VR workshop. Christine?
Thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it and look forward to connecting with you in your spaces and how we can help you to achieve your learning and development goals.